The cabin looked like something a child might build with handfuls of dirt. That is what the neighbors said. That is what they laughed about over coffee in the trading post. That is what they would remember with shame when winter came. It was August 1889 in the Yukon Territory, and Mikael Petrov was covering his newly built log cabin with 6 inches of mud mixed with grass and moss. His neighbors, tough men who had survived multiple Yukon winters, thought he had lost his mind. They had seen cold before. They knew what worked. And what Mikael was doing, smearing mud all over a perfectly good cabin like some kind of primitive madman, that was not it. John McGregor, whose claim bordered Mikael's to the east, stood watching the strange spectacle with his arms crossed. McGregor was 43 years old, a veteran of 7 Yukon winters, and considered himself something of an authority on survival in the North. He had helped build dozens of cabins. He knew the right way to do things. "You planning to bake that cabin like a clay pot?" McGregor called out. "Maybe fire it in a kiln?" Mikael looked up from his work. His hands were caked with mud up to his elbows. His face was streaked with dirt. He did not smile. "In Russia, we build this way for hundreds of years. It works." "This is not Russia, friend. This is the Yukon. We build with logs here, good thick logs. That is what keeps the cold out." "Logs are good. Mud makes them better." McGregor shook his head and walked away. That night, at the trading post, he told everyone about the Russian fellow who was wasting his time plastering his cabin with mud. The story spread quickly. By the next day, Mikael Petrov had become something of a local joke, but Mikael did not stop. He had learned his building techniques in the Ural Mountains of Russia, where winter temperatures could drop to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. He had seen what worked and what killed people, and he knew that what he was doing, however strange it looked to these men, would save his life when the deep cold came. What Mikael understood, and what his neighbors did not, was that logs alone were never enough against the true killing cold. Wood was a decent insulator, better than stone or metal, but it had limitations. A 12-inch log wall had but an R value of approximately 12 to 15. That would keep you alive in a moderate winter. But in a truly brutal Yukon winter, when temperatures dropped below minus 40 for weeks at a time, when the cold became a living thing that sought out every gap and weakness in your shelter, 12 to 15 R value was barely adequate. Mikael's mud technique would change everything. The 6-inch layer of mud, grass, and moss mixture he was applying to the exterior of his cabin would add another R value of approximately 10 to 12. Combined with the logs, his walls would have an effective R value of 22 to 27. Nearly double what his neighbors had, but the mockery continued. As Mikael worked day after day, covering every inch of his cabin's exterior with the mud mixture, neighbors would stop by to watch and make jokes. Some were good-natured, others were not. "You are going to have a hell of a time when that mud freezes and cracks off," said William Hart, a prospector who had been in the territory for 5 years. "Come spring, you will have mud chunks falling on your head." "The mud will not crack if it is made correctly," Mikael replied calmly. "The grass holds it together. The moss makes it flexible. It breathes with the wood." "Breathes with the wood," Hart repeated mockingly. "You hear that, boys? The mud breathes." The men laughed. Mikael kept working. The truth was, Mikael's mud mixture was far more sophisticated than his neighbors understood. It was not just mud. It was a carefully proportioned mixture of clay, rich soil, dried grass, moss, and a small amount of animal manure. The clay provided the binding strength. The grass provided tensile reinforcement, like rebar in concrete. The moss made the mixture flexible and helped it adhere to the wood. The manure, though it sounded disgusting, contained enzymes and fibers that improved the mixture's durability and water resistance. This was not a primitive technique. This was centuries of accumulated knowledge, refined through countless winters by people who understood that survival depended on getting the details right. Mikael had started preparing his mud mixture in July, 2 months before he began applying it. He had dug clay from a specific location along the river where the soil had the right consistency. He had collected grass and dried it thoroughly. He had gathered moss from the north sides of trees where it grew thick and healthy. He had mixed everything in specific proportions, added water, and let it sit for weeks to age and ferment slightly. The aging process was critical. Fresh mud would crack. Aged mud, with its fibers properly hydrated and its components fully integrated, would dry into a solid, flexible coating that could expand and contract with the wood without breaking. By late August, Mikael's cabin looked like a giant mud sculpture. The smooth brown coating covered every log, every gap, every surface. The neighbors had stopped making jokes in person, but the talk continued. Some thought he was crazy. Others thought he was just stubborn. A few thought he might be onto something, but nobody was willing to admit it out loud. There was one more element to Mikael's design that drew particular ridicule. After the mud dried, he covered it with a thin layer of lime wash. Lime wash was made from slaked lime mixed with water. It created a white, breathable coating that protected the mud from moisture and reflected sunlight. "Now he is painting his mud cabin white," McGregor said at the Trading Post. "Like a fancy mansion in San Francisco. That mud is not enough. He needs to pretty it up." But Mikael knew exactly what he was doing. The lime wash served multiple purposes. It protected the mud from rain erosion. It prevented moss and mildew from growing on the surface. It reflected summer heat, keeping the cabin cooler. And in winter, it sealed the surface against wind-driven snow. By September, Mikael's cabin was complete. From the outside, it looked strange. The white-coated walls were smooth and rounded where the mud had covered the log corners. It did not look like any cabin in the Yukon territory. It looked foreign, different, wrong, to eyes accustomed to traditional log construction. Inside, Mikael had also made modifications that puzzled his neighbors. He had built a massive masonry heater, what Russians called a pechka, in the center of the cabin instead of a traditional fireplace against one wall. The structure was made from river stones carefully mortared together. It was huge, taking up nearly a quarter of the cabin's interior space. The pechka was not like a regular fireplace. It had a firebox where wood burned, but instead of the smoke going straight up a chimney, it traveled through a series of internal channels within the masonry structure. These channels forced the hot smoke to give up its heat to the stones before finally exiting through a chimney at the back. The design meant that a hot fire burned for just 2 to 3 hours would heat the entire mass of stone. That mass, sometimes weighing 2 to 3 tons, would then radiate heat for 12 to 18 hours. Mikael could heat his cabin with one short hot fire per day instead of maintaining a constant fire. His neighbors thought this was the most wasteful thing yet. All that space taken up by stones, all that work hauling and mortaring them. McGregor had looked at it and shaken his head. "A good fireplace against the wall is all a man needs," he said. "This contraption is ridiculous." But Mikael had built it exactly as his grandfather had taught him. The pechka was the heart of a Russian winter home. It was the difference between survival and misery in the Ural Mountains. And it would be the difference here. September turned to October. The first snows came, light and manageable. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit at night, cold but not dangerous. Every cabin in the area stayed reasonably warm. Mikael burned his daily fire in the pechka, heating the stones, and his cabin remained comfortable through the night. His neighbors burned wood constantly in their fireplaces, feeding the flames every few hours to maintain warmth. They went through firewood at a steady pace. Mikael used a fraction of what they burned. November brought colder weather. Temperatures dropped to 0, then -10, then -20. Snow fell heavily. The landscape transformed into a white wilderness. This was normal Yukon winter weather, difficult but manageable for experienced men. Mikael's cabin performed beautifully. The thick mud coating on the exterior prevented heat from conducting through the log walls. The Pechka's thermal mass released steady warmth through the day and night. He burned one fire daily, using perhaps 2 armloads of wood. The cabin stayed warm enough that he could work inside without heavy clothing. His neighbors were burning wood constantly now. Their fireplaces consumed cord after cord. They woke multiple times each night to feed the flames. If they let the fire die, the cabin would be freezing by morning. They were managing, but it was hard work. Then December came, and everything changed. The first week of December brought a cold snap, unlike anything the old-timers could remember. The temperature dropped to -30, then -40, then -50. And it stayed there. At -50 degrees Fahrenheit, the world transforms. Metal becomes brittle and can shatter. Breath freezes instantly into ice crystals that tinkle when they hit the ground. Exposed skin freezes in under a minute. Trees explode with loud cracks as the sap freezes and expands. The air itself seems to crystallize. And at -50, the inadequacies of every structure become brutally apparent. John McGregor's cabin, which had seemed perfectly adequate for 7 years, became a desperate struggle for survival. His fireplace roared constantly, consuming enormous amounts of wood. But the heat radiated up the chimney and out through the walls almost as fast as he could produce it. The single-thickness log walls, with R value of 12 to 15, simply could not hold heat against this level of cold. Frost formed on the interior walls. Ice crystals grew on the ceiling. A water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the fireplace. McGregor wore every piece of clothing he owned inside his cabin, and still shivered. He slept as close to the fireplace as he dared, and still woke with frozen breath coating his blankets. If he let the fire die for even 2 hours, the interior temperature would drop to near outside temperature. The cold was relentless, probing every gap, stealing every bit of warmth. McGregor had never experienced anything like it. He began to wonder if he would survive. William Hart's situation was even worse. His cabin was smaller and had been built quickly. The chinking between the logs had dried and cracked. Wind whistled through gaps he could not find to plug. His fireplace consumed wood at a terrifying rate, and still the cabin remained barely above freezing. Hart burned every stick of furniture he could spare. He burned boards he had saved for spring projects. He ventured out into the brutal cold multiple times a day to bring in more firewood, risking frostbite with every trip. He was going through his entire winter's supply of wood in a matter of days. Other neighbors faced similar crises. The trading post became a gathering place where exhausted, frost-bitten men compared notes on their struggles. Everyone was burning more wood than they had. Everyone was colder than they had ever been. And everyone was starting to realize that if this cold continued, some people might not make it to spring. Nobody talked about Mikael Petrov's cabin, but everyone thought about it, because smoke still rose steadily from Mikael's chimney, just once a day. In the morning, thick smoke would pour out for 2 to 3 hours. Then it would taper to nothing. And that was it. 1 fire per day, while everyone else burned wood non-stop. On December 10, 1889, 5 days into the deep cold, John McGregor swallowed his pride and walked to Mikael's cabin. He was wearing every piece of clothing he owned, and still the cold cut through him like knives. His beard was a mass of ice from frozen breath. His fingers and toes were numb. He was exhausted from constant wood hauling and fire tending. He knocked on Mikael's door, and when it opened, warm air poured out. Real warmth, the kind McGregor had not felt in days. Mikael stood in the doorway wearing a simple shirt and pants. No coat, no hat. He looked comfortable. "Come in," Mikael said. "It is too cold to stand outside." McGregor stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. The difference was staggering. The cabin was genuinely warm, perhaps 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior walls showed no frost. The air was dry and comfortable. A lantern burned on the table. Mikael had been reading. The massive Petka dominated the center of the room. McGregor walked to it and placed his hand on the stones. They were warm, not hot, but radiating a steady, gentle heat. "You are not burning a fire," McGregor said. "I burned this morning for 2 hours. The stones will keep the cabin warm until tomorrow morning." "How?" Mikael explained the principle of thermal mass. The stones absorbed heat from the fire. That heat was then released slowly over many hours. Because the stones were inside the insulated envelope of the cabin, surrounded by the mud-coated walls, the heat stayed in the living space instead of escaping outside. "But what about the walls?" McGregor asked. "My walls, they leak heat. I can feel it. No matter how hot the fire burns, the cabin stays cold. Your walls are just logs. Wood is not a good insulator. It is better than stone or metal, but not good enough for this cold. The mud makes the difference." McGregor looked at the interior walls. From the inside, they looked like normal log walls, but he knew that outside, under the white lime wash, was that 6-inch layer of mud that everyone had mocked. "How much better?" he asked quietly. "Maybe 2 times better, maybe more. The R value goes from 12 or 15 to 25 or more. The cold cannot push through." McGregor stood in the warmth, thinking about his own cabin where frost grew on the walls, and he shivered despite a roaring fire. He thought about all the jokes, all the mockery, all the certainty that Mikael was wrong. "I was a fool," he said finally. "You did not know. Now you know. Can it be fixed? My cabin, can I add mud to it now?" Mikael shook his head. "Not in winter. The mud would freeze before it dries. It would crack and fall off. You need warm weather to apply it properly." "So I have to survive this winter the hard way." "Yes, but I can help. You can stay here if you need to. There is room." McGregor looked around the cabin. It was smaller than his, with much of the space taken by the massive Petka. But it was warm. God, it was warm. "I will manage," he said. "But I will remember this, and come spring I will be building different." Over the next week, other neighbors made similar pilgrimages to Mikael's cabin. Each man arrived frozen and exhausted. Each man experienced the shocking warmth inside, and each man left with a new understanding of just how wrong they had been. William Hart asked if he could purchase some of Mikael's firewood, as his supply was running dangerously low. Mikael gave him 2 cords for free, wood he could spare because his cabin used so little. The temperature remained below -40 for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of cold that tested every structure, every preparation, every decision made in warmer months. 3 weeks that separated good construction from barely adequate. Mikael's cabin never wavered. 1 fire per day and the Petka kept the interior comfortable. The mud walls held the heat inside. The lime wash protected the mud from frost damage. Everything worked exactly as centuries of Russian building knowledge said it would. His neighbors suffered. They burned through their firewood supplies at alarming rates. They woke exhausted every morning from tending fires through the night. Some developed frostbite. A few faced the real possibility of running out of wood before spring. But they survived. Barely. And when the temperature finally rose in January, climbing back to a merely brutal -20, everyone felt like they had been granted a reprieve. The lessons of that winter spread quickly. By spring, when the temperature warmed enough to work outside, half the cabins in the area were being modified. Men who had mocked Mikael's mud technique were now begging him for instructions. Mikael taught anyone who asked. He showed them how to select the right clay, how to mix in the proper proportions of grass and moss, how to let the mixture age, how to apply it in layers, how to finish with lime wash. He explained why each step mattered. The work was hard and time-consuming. Men who had thrown up their cabins in 2 or 3 weeks found themselves spending months properly insulating them, but nobody complained. They had felt the killing cold. They knew what was at stake. John McGregor spent the entire summer of 1890 rebuilding his cabin. He did not just add mud to the existing structure. He tore everything down and started over, building it right from the foundation up. Thicker logs, carefully seasoned, double wall construction in critical areas, 6 inches of mud mixed with grass and moss over every exterior surface, lime wash coating, and in the center of the cabin, a massive pechka built from river stones. "I should have built it this way the first time," he told Mikael, as they worked together on the pechka. "Would have saved myself a winter of misery." "Now you know," Mikael replied, "and your children and grandchildren will know. That is how knowledge survives." The winter of 1890 to 91 was milder than the previous one, but still cold enough to test the improvements. McGregor's rebuilt cabin performed beautifully. The mud walls held heat as promised. The pechka radiated warmth through the day and night from a single morning fire. He used a quarter of the firewood he had burned the previous winter and stayed twice as warm. All across the area, newly mud-coated cabins proved their worth. The technique that had been mocked as primitive and foolish became recognized as sophisticated and essential. Within a few years, nearly every cabin built in that part of the Yukon Territory incorporated the mud insulation technique, but the story spread beyond that immediate area. Prospectors and trappers carried the knowledge to other regions. They told the story of the Russian fellow who wrapped his cabin in mud and stayed warm at -55 while everyone else froze. They described the technique in detail to anyone who would listen. The use of earth-based insulation was not new. Indigenous peoples around the world had used similar techniques for thousands of years. Adobe construction in the American Southwest, cob cottages in England, mud brick structures throughout Africa and the Middle East. The principle was ancient and proven. What Mikael brought to the Yukon was the specific application of this knowledge to extreme cold weather survival. He demonstrated that earth insulation could work even at -50 degrees Fahrenheit if done correctly. He showed that the combination of log construction with mud coating could create walls with R values high enough to make winter survival not just possible, but comfortable. The technical explanation for why the mud worked so well lies in understanding heat transfer. Heat moves through materials in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Good insulation minimizes all 3. Logs alone resist conductive heat transfer moderately well. Wood has tiny air pockets in its cellular structure, and trapped air is an excellent insulator. But logs also have gaps between them where air can move, allowing convective heat loss. And wood itself conducts heat, though more slowly than metal or stone. The mud coating changed everything. The 6-inch layer of earth mixed with organic material had very low thermal conductivity. It conducted heat much more slowly than wood. The organic fibers trapped additional air pockets, further reducing conductivity. And when properly applied, the mud sealed all gaps between logs, eliminating convective heat loss through air movement. The result was a wall system with total R value more than double that of logs alone. And in extreme cold, that difference meant everything. The pechka or masonry heater added another layer of efficiency. Traditional fireplaces are notoriously inefficient, allowing most of the heat to escape up the chimney. A well-designed pechka captured 80 to 90% of the heat produced by burning wood. The massive stones absorbed this heat, then released it slowly through radiation. Because the stones were inside the insulated space, that radiant heat warmed the cabin instead of being lost to the outside. The combination of superior insulation and efficient heating created a structure that required far less fuel while providing far more comfort. But beyond the technical explanations lay something more fundamental. Mikael's success demonstrated the value of traditional knowledge, accumulated over generations through trial and error in harsh conditions. His neighbors had assumed that their way, the way everyone in the Yukon built cabins, was the best way simply because it was familiar. They had not questioned whether better methods existed. They had not sought knowledge from different sources or traditions. They had done what everyone did and assumed that was sufficient. Mikael brought knowledge from a different harsh environment, the Ural Mountains of Russia, where winter survival had been refined over centuries. He trusted that knowledge even when faced with mockery. And he was proven right when the true test came. This pattern repeats throughout history. People face new challenges using old methods, assuming those methods are sufficient because they worked before. Then someone arrives with different knowledge from a different tradition and shows that better solutions exist. The initial reaction is often mockery or dismissal. The unfamiliar is labeled as strange, primitive, or foolish. But when the crisis comes, when conditions push everyone to their limits, the truth becomes clear. The person who was mocked for their strange methods survives comfortably while others struggle desperately. If you're enjoying the story of forgotten survival techniques and the wisdom of traditional knowledge, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We share stories like this regularly, exploring the skills and insights our ancestors developed to survive in harsh conditions. Don't miss out on these fascinating pieces of history. The trading post in that part of the Yukon became something of a gathering place for discussions about building techniques. Men who had previously shared only hunting stories and gold strike rumors now debated the finer points of mud mixture ratios and pechka design. Mikael became an informal teacher, respected for his knowledge. He never boasted about being right. He never reminded people of their earlier mockery. He simply shared what he knew, patiently explaining the principles and techniques that had saved his life and could save theirs. This generosity of knowledge sharing was itself a tradition he had learned in Russia. In harsh environments where everyone faced the same deadly challenges, hoarding survival knowledge was seen as immoral. You shared what you knew because someday you might need knowledge from someone else. The community survived together or died together. By the mid-1890s, the appearance of cabins in that region had changed dramatically. The mud-coated, lime-washed structures stood out against the landscape, looking oddly Mediterranean or Middle Eastern despite being in the frozen north. Visitors unfamiliar with the harsh winters sometimes commented on how strange the cabins looked. The residents would smile and explain about the winter of 1889, when the temperature dropped to minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. They would tell the story of the Russian man who wrapped his cabin in mud while everyone laughed. They would describe the brutal weeks when people thought they might not survive, while Mikael sat comfortably in his warm cabin, burning one fire per day. And then they would run their hands over the smooth mud walls of their own cabins and say, "We learned. We are not too proud to learn. Liarsti." Mikael Petrov lived in that cabin until his death in 1913 at the age of 74. He married in 1892 a widow named Sarah Mackenzie, who had lost her husband to pneumonia. They raised 4 children in the mud-coated cabin. The structure required maintenance over the years. The lime wash needed to be reapplied every few years to maintain its protective qualities. Occasional cracks in the mud needed patching, but the basic integrity of the walls remained sound for decades. When Mikael's children built their own cabins, they used his techniques. When neighbors asked for advice, he gave it freely until the end of his life. The knowledge he had brought from Russia and adapted to the Yukon became embedded in the building traditions of that region. The cabin itself stood until the 1940s, when it was finally torn down to make room for a more modern structure. But before it was demolished, it was documented by a historian interested in frontier building techniques. Photographs show the thick mud walls, the lime wash coating, and the interior pechka. Samples of the mud were analyzed, confirming the sophisticated mix of clay grass, moss, and organic material. The analysis showed that the mud had retained its insulating properties for over 50 years, a testament to the quality of Mikael's original work. Some of the river stones from the Petka were saved and later donated to a museum in Whitehorse, where they are displayed as examples of traditional Yukon heating technology. A small placard tells the story of Mikael Petrov and his mud-wrapped cabin. The technical innovations Mikael brought to the Yukon were eventually superseded by modern materials. Fiberglass insulation, foam boards, and advanced building papers provided easier ways to achieve high R values. The labor-intensive process of mixing and applying mud coating became obsolete as commercial products became available. But the underlying principles remained valid. High insulation values are essential in extreme cold. Thermal mass inside the insulated envelope improves comfort and reduces fuel use. Sealing air leaks is critical. These lessons, learned the hard way in the winter of 1889, continue to inform modern cold climate construction. The story also highlights a pattern we see repeatedly in frontier and survival situations. The person who takes more time, who builds more carefully, who incorporates knowledge from different traditions, is often mocked as overcautious or wasteful. The quick and dirty approach is praised as practical and efficient. Then the crisis comes. The extreme weather, the equipment failure, the unexpected disaster. And suddenly the person who prepared carefully, who built solid foundations, who took the time to do things right, that person survives while others struggle or perish. This was true for Jonas Fletcher in the Wind River Valley, building his double-wall cabin in the 1830s. It was true for Thomas Erickson in Dakota Territory, building his sawdust-insulated cabin in 1880. And it was true for Mikael Petrov in the Yukon, wrapping his cabin in mud in 1889. Each man faced mockery for their careful, time-consuming preparations. Each man was told they were wasting effort on unnecessary precautions. And each man was vindicated when the worst-case scenario arrived, and their preparations meant the difference between comfort and suffering, sometimes between life and death. The modern reader might wonder whether such extreme cold still poses these challenges. With modern heating systems, insulated walls, and reliable fuel supplies, surely we are safe from the kind of desperate cold that tested these frontier builders. But consider what happens when those modern systems fail. A power outage in deep winter, a furnace breakdown, a supply chain disruption that prevents fuel delivery. Suddenly, the quality of your home's basic insulation becomes critical again. The ability to heat with alternative sources matters. The knowledge of how to maintain warmth with limited resources becomes survival information. The winter storms that swept across Texas in February 2021, bringing cold temperatures to a region unprepared for them, demonstrated this reality. Modern homes with electric heat became uninhabitable when the power failed. People struggled to stay warm in houses that had been comfortable hours before. Some died from cold or carbon monoxide poisoning from desperate attempts to heat with unsafe methods. In a well-insulated home with a proper wood stove or fireplace, that crisis would have been uncomfortable but manageable. The people who had prepared for worst-case scenarios, who had backup heating and good insulation, weathered the storm. Those who relied entirely on modern systems suffered. This is the enduring lesson of Mikael Petrov's story. Preparation matters. Knowledge matters. Taking the time to build proper foundations and systems matters. And sometimes the wisdom of older traditions, the accumulated knowledge of people who faced similar challenges without modern conveniences, can teach us things we desperately need to know. The mockery Mikael faced was not unique to the 1880s Yukon. It is a pattern that repeats whenever someone chooses to prepare more carefully than seems necessary. Preppers and survivalists today face similar dismissiveness. People who maintain larger food stores, who learn traditional skills, who prepare for disasters that might never come, they are often labeled as paranoid or obsessive. But history shows us repeatedly that the prepared survive crises that devastate the unprepared. The challenge is distinguishing between reasonable preparation and genuinely paranoid behavior. Mikael's approach provides a useful model. He did not prepare for impossible scenarios or imaginary threats. He prepared for conditions he knew were possible because he had experienced them before. He brought knowledge from one harsh environment and applied it to another similar environment. He used proven techniques, not experimental ideas. And he prepared proportionally to the actual risks he faced. This is reasonable preparation, understanding what challenges are genuinely possible in your environment, learning proven methods for dealing with those challenges, and investing time and resources proportional to the risks. Mikael spent months preparing his cabin because he knew winter in the Yukon could be lethal. That was proportional and reasonable. His neighbors built quickly because they had not experienced the worst the Yukon could deliver. Their preparation was based on recent mild winters, not the full range of possibilities. When the extreme arrived, their preparation proved inadequate. The technical knowledge Mikael possessed about mud construction and thermal mass heating is largely lost in modern North American culture. Most people today would not know how to mix proper mud coating, let alone apply it correctly or maintain it over time. The knowledge of masonry heater construction is similarly rare. This represents a broader loss of traditional building knowledge. Modern construction relies on purchased materials and professional expertise. The average person cannot build their own shelter without buying lumber, insulation, and various manufactured products. The skills to create shelter from raw materials available in the local environment have largely disappeared. This creates vulnerability. When supply chains function normally, when stores are stocked and delivery trucks run, the system works fine. But when disruptions occur, when materials become unavailable or unaffordable, the inability to build or improve shelter using traditional methods becomes a serious limitation. Some people are working to preserve and revive these traditional skills. Natural building workshops teach techniques like cob construction, adobe, and earth plastering. Books and online resources document traditional methods. But this knowledge remains marginal, known to a small number of enthusiasts rather than being common knowledge. The story of Mikael's cabin suggests that this marginal knowledge might become critically important again. Climate change is producing more extreme weather events. Economic instability threatens supply chains. Energy costs fluctuate wildly. The conditions that made traditional building knowledge essential might return, even to regions that have not needed it for generations. And when those conditions arrive, the people who preserved the knowledge, who learned the traditional techniques, who prepared with unfashionable methods, they will be the ones who thrive while others struggle. Before we continue with more of Mikael's story, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. We regularly share fascinating stories about traditional skills, forgotten knowledge, and the ingenious ways our ancestors solved problems. Hit that bell icon so you don't miss future episodes. Your support helps us keep bringing these important stories to light. The winter of 1889 remained legendary in Yukon Territory for decades. Old-timers would refer to it as the year the cold came to stay. Temperature records from that winter, where they exist, confirm the extreme conditions. Several weather stations recorded temperatures below -50 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods. The human cost was documented in trading post records and later historical accounts. At least 23 people died in that winter in the central Yukon region, though some historians believe the actual number was higher, as not all deaths were officially recorded. Most died from cold-related causes, including hypothermia, frostbite complications, and accidents related to the extreme weather. The livestock losses were catastrophic. Horses and cattle that had survived previous winters perished. Even hardy sled dogs suffered, with many dying from exposure despite their thick coats. The extreme cold tested every living thing's ability to survive. Against this backdrop of suffering and death, Mikael's comfortable survival in his mud-wrapped cabin stood out dramatically. He not only survived, but did so with relative ease, never facing the desperate struggle that characterized his neighbors' winters. This contrast was not lost on the survivors. When spring came and people assessed the damage and counted their losses, the lessons were clear. Adequate preparation was not enough. Good enough was not good enough. You prepared for the worst, or you risked everything. The cabins built in the years following that winter reflected this understanding. The construction standards in the region improved dramatically. People took more time, used better techniques, and sought advice from those who knew how to build for extreme conditions. Mikael became an informal consultant for anyone building or improving a cabin. He would visit building sites, examine the work, and offer suggestions. He taught people how to test their mud mixture for proper consistency. He showed them how to apply it in layers for maximum adhesion. He explained the importance of proper drying time. He also shared his knowledge of the pechka, though fewer people adopted this technology. Building a proper masonry heater required significant skill and effort. Many preferred to stick with traditional fireplaces, accepting the lower efficiency in exchange for simpler construction. But those who did build pechkas, following Mikael's guidance, found the benefits compelling. The reduction in firewood consumption alone justified the effort. A cabin with a pechka could get through winter on half the wood required by a similar cabin with a traditional fireplace. This fuel efficiency had environmental implications as well. The forests around established settlements were already showing signs of overuse. Every cabin needed firewood, and in the extreme cold, the consumption rates were enormous. The pressure on local timber resources was unsustainable. Cabins with better insulation and more efficient heating reduced this pressure. They used less wood while providing better comfort. This allowed the forests to recover somewhat, ensuring that future wood supplies would remain available. Mikael's own firewood consumption illustrated the difference. In the brutal winter of 1889, while his neighbors burned 10 to 15 cords of wood trying to stay warm, Mikael used approximately 3 cords. The same brutal cold, the same length of winter, but less than a quarter of the fuel consumption. This efficiency came from the combination of superior insulation and thermal mass heating. The mud walls held heat inside. The pechka extracted maximum heat from the wood burned. The result was a system that required minimal input to maintain comfortable conditions. Modern energy efficiency experts would recognize Mikael's cabin as an example of passive house principles, though that term would not be invented for another century. The focus on superior insulation, air sealing, and efficient heat recovery created a structure that needed very little active heating to remain comfortable. The techniques Mikael used were not unique to Russian building traditions. Similar approaches developed independently in many cold climate regions. Scandinavian countries used earth insulation and masonry heaters. Some Chinese building traditions incorporated thermal mass walls and earth sheltering. Indigenous peoples across northern regions developed sophisticated insulation techniques using local materials. What all these traditions shared was generations of experience living in harsh conditions without access to abundant fuel or modern heating technology. They were forced to build efficiently because inefficiency meant death. The accumulated knowledge represented genuine expertise earned through countless winters and refined through trial and error. When people moved to new regions, they often abandoned these traditional techniques in favor of quicker, easier methods. The early phase of any frontier settlement typically featured rough, barely adequate structures thrown up quickly to provide immediate shelter. Only after experiencing the full range of conditions in the new environment did people begin to build more carefully. And often, the best practices involved returning to traditional techniques that had been temporarily abandoned. This cycle played out repeatedly across the North American frontier. Quick construction using minimal time and materials. A brutal winter or other crisis that demonstrated the inadequacy of quick methods, and then a return to more sophisticated traditional building techniques. Mikael's story represents one example of this cycle, compressed into a single dramatic winter. The quick cabins failed. The carefully built traditional structure succeeded. The lessons were learned and building practices improved. But the cycle required a teacher, someone who knew the better methods and was willing to share that knowledge. Without Mikael, the other settlers might have eventually figured out better insulation techniques through their own experimentation, but they also might have continued struggling, never quite solving the problem, losing people to the cold each winter. The presence of someone with proven knowledge made all the difference. This highlights the importance of preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge. Every generation that loses these skills makes the next generation more vulnerable. When crisis comes, they have to relearn lessons their ancestors already knew, often at great cost. Mikael himself had learned his building techniques from his grandfather, who had learned from his grandfather, going back generations in the Ural Mountains. That unbroken chain of knowledge transmission ensured that each generation started with proven methods rather than having to figure everything out from scratch. When Mikael taught his children and his neighbors, he extended that chain into a new land. The knowledge adapted to local conditions but maintained its core principles. Future generations in the Yukon would benefit from lessons learned centuries earlier in Russia. This is how human knowledge accumulates and survives, not through formal institutions or written documentation, though those help, but through person-to-person transmission of practical skills, tested by experience and validated by survival. The tragedy is how easily this transmission can be broken. One generation decides the old ways are obsolete. They adopt new methods without preserving knowledge of the old ones. Then, when the new methods fail or prove inadequate, the old knowledge is gone. Modern society faces this challenge with many traditional skills. The number of people who can build with traditional materials, who understand passive heating and cooling, who can create shelter without industrial products, that number shrinks each year. When those people die, their knowledge dies with them unless they find students to teach. Mikael lived long enough to teach dozens of people. His knowledge spread widely and persisted for generations. But he was lucky to have students willing to learn. Many traditional knowledge holders today struggle to find anyone interested in learning what they know. The mud-wrapped cabin in the Yukon represents more than just a clever building technique. It represents the value of traditional knowledge, the importance of taking time to build properly, the wisdom of learning from people who have solved similar problems in different places, and the life or death importance of preparing for worst-case scenarios. These lessons remain relevant today. We live in an era of climate instability, where extreme weather events are becoming more common. We face supply chain vulnerabilities that can leave us without resources we take for granted. We depend on complex systems that can fail catastrophically. In this context, the person who takes time to prepare properly, who learns traditional skills, who builds resilience into their life and property, that person might seem overcautious or paranoid until the crisis comes. Then they become the person everyone wishes they had listened to. Mikael Petrov was that person in the Yukon in 1889. His neighbors laughed when he wrapped his cabin in mud. They mocked his massive pechka. They thought he was wasting time and effort on unnecessary precautions. Then the temperature dropped to minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for weeks. And Mikael sat comfortably in his warm cabin, burning one fire per day, while his neighbors fought desperately for survival. The story spread across the Yukon Territory and beyond. It became a legend of frontier wisdom, of the value of traditional knowledge, and of the importance of building for worst-case scenarios. And it remains a lesson worth remembering today. Because the climate will test us, disasters will come, systems will fail, and when they do, the difference between comfortable survival and desperate struggle will come down to how well we prepared, not how much we bought or how much technology we owned, but how solid our foundations were, how much knowledge we possessed, and how willing we were to learn from those who had faced similar challenges before. The neighbors laughed when Mikael wrapped his cabin in mud. But when winter came and the killing cold arrived, their laughter died. And in the warmth of that mud-wrapped cabin, heated by a fire that burned just once per day, Mikael Petrov proved that the old wisdom was not foolishness. It was survival. And that is a lesson that will never go out of style.